Jai Hind दोस्तों, today we are going to study the Monroe Doctrine, which was the foundation for US policy in the Americas. So it was a pivotal declaration that shaped the hemispheric politics for 2 centuries and remains central to understanding the US foreign policy and international relations. The Monroe Doctrine. See, the historical context, early 19th century global shifts. Now we will first understand the historical context of this doctrine. See, in 1823 independence wave came, so Latin American countries started breaking free from Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule. So the world was divided like this, between Spain and Portugal, and then various Latin American countries which were specifically occupied by Spain and also some of them occupied by Portuguese started breaking free. European threats were there: Spain, France, Russia contemplating recolonization efforts to restore their imperial influence in the Americas. So, this is the region we are talking about. This region. Alright. The US rising power. Uh, so the United States emerged as a regional force which was determined to prevent European intervention in the Western Hemisphere. Alright, in the Western Hemisphere. Now let us see the Monroe Doctrine. So Monroe Doctrine had four core principles and it was instituted in 1823. See here 1823. Alright, so when the first wave of colonialism ended at that point of time, the Monroe Doctrine introduced the four core principles. First core principle was no European interference. European powers were prohibited from meddling in the internal affairs of American nations. Alright. American nations like the Latin American nations. Can we see some of the names? See, here you will find Costa Rica. You can see. And here you are finding Nicaragua, El Salvador, all of them. See, Honduras. So, Honduras is basically bordering the Caribbean Sea and then the Atlantic. El Salvador and Costa Rica is bordering the Pacific Ocean. Then we have Guatemala touching the Pacific as well as the Atlantic, and we have Belize, which only touches the Atlantic Ocean. All right, so Belize is there, Mosquitia is there, all of them is are touching which coast? The Atlantic coast. Panama, as we see, is the connection link, isthmus between the Southern American uh, portion and between the Latin American portion. Alright, and these are the Central American group of islands, like Cuba is there, Dominican Republic is there, Haiti is there, Jamaica is there, Puerto Rico is there. Alright, so now let us continue. We were talking about the core principles. No European interference. तो मोनरो डॉक्ट्रिन में बता दिया कि कोई यूरोपियन पावर्स की इंटरफेरेंस नहीं हो सकती इंटरनल अफेयर्स ऑफ अमेरिकन नेशंस में. दूसरा, क्लोज टू कोलोनाइजेशन, मतलब वेस्टर्न हेमिस्फीयर was declared off limits to any future European colonization. So out of the globe, now Western Hemisphere cannot be colonized by the European powers. This was what was introduced in the Monroe Doctrine. US non-intervention. America pledged not to interfere in European internal matters or existing colonial territories. मतलब सबसे पहले तो यूरोप इंटरफेयर नहीं करेगा अमेरिका के मैटर्स में, और दूसरा अमेरिका इंटरफेयर नहीं करेगा यूरोप के मैटर्स में. और चौथा क्या है? हॉस्टाइल एक्ट वार्निंग. Any European attempt to control American nations would be viewed as a threat to US peace and security. Alright. This is in context of the recent uh, Denmark wala issue highlighted by the US and overarching, you can say overreaching uh, influence of the US in the international order, which is disturbing the rule based order. So, we are discussing it in this context. Now, see, let us see the key figures behind this doctrine. सबसे पहले President James Monroe delivered the doctrine in his 7th inaugural message to Congress on 2nd December 1823, defining principle of American foreign policy. Alright, so it forms a very important part of American foreign policy. Then we have two more people who are associated with this doctrine. One is John Quincy Adams. As Secretary of State, he was principal architect who insisted on the unilateral U.S. action, rejecting the British partnership proposals, and George Canning, British Foreign Minister, who proposed joint Anglo-American declaration to deter European powers, and ultimately it was rejected by Adams. All right, so these are also two people. Are you able to understand these two people? Alright, he is the Adams who rejected it, and President James Monroe. Now let us move forward. Let us see certain strategic motivations and impact. Analysis of this is extremely crucial. सबसे पहले, it protected new republics. It safeguarded the newly independent Latin American nations while advancing US territorial and commercial interests in the region. Secondly, it prevented mercantilism. It blocked European mercantilist systems and colonial restoration that threatened the free trade and American economic growth. All right, so America's economy could grow. Mercantilist system is wherein US wanted to only have the European nations wanted to only have the dollars out of the exchange of trade, and they only wish to export and not import. So when we study in economics, we study various kinds of competitions. First, is the mercantilism. Then usse acha is uh, absolute advantage. Then we have comparative advantage. All of these are studied in international economics. All right, so this doctrine prevented what? Mercantilism. हाँ जी, इट प्रोटेक्टेड न्यू रिपब्लिक्स कि भाई नए जो लैटिन अमेरिकन नेशंस है वो भी तो सेफ रहे, उनके कमर्शियल इंटरेस्ट भी तो प्रोपोगेट हो पाए. और सेपरेट स्फीयर्स. एस्टैब्लिश डिस्टिंक्ट जोन्स ऑफ इन्फ्लुएंस. एस्टैब्लिश्ड व्हाट? डिस्टिंक्ट जोन्स ऑफ इन्फ्लुएंस. द अमेरिकास फॉर द अमेरिकन्स एंड द यूरोप फॉर द यूरोपियंस. ऑल राइट, फंडामेंटली रीशेपिंग द पावर डायनामिक्स. समझ में आया? अमेरिका फॉर अमेरिकन एंड यूरोप फॉर यूरोपियंस. सो इट वॉज इनिशियली डिसमिस्ड बाय यूरोपियन पावर्स. द डॉक्ट्रिन इवॉल्व्ड इनटू कॉर्नरस्टोन ऑफ यूएस फॉरेन पॉलिसी, शेपिंग हेमिस्फेरिक रिलेशंस फॉर जनरेशंस. तो यूरोपियन पावर्स ने उसे डिसमिस किया पहले, क्योंकि हाँ उनका स्फीयर ऑफ इन्फ्लुएंस रिड्यूस हो रहा था, बट इट इवॉल्व्ड एज अ कॉर्नरस्टोन ऑफ यूएस फॉरेन पॉलिसी जी. फिर एवोल्यूशन अपन देखें तो रूजवेल्ट, कोरोलरी, एंड देन वी हैव दिस यूएस इंटरवेंशनिज्म. सो 1904 में रूजवेल्ट कोरोलरी के तहत जो रूजवेल्ट था उसने एक्सपैंड करने की कोशिश की इस डॉक्ट्रिन को, क्लेमिंग यूएस राइट टू एक्सरसाइज इंटरनेशनल पुलिस पावर थ्रू आउट लैटिन अमेरिका. ठीक है, उसके बाद जो ये अब एवोल्यूशन है इस पर्टिकुलर डॉक्ट्रिन का. और फिर आगे देखिए, मिलिट्री इंटरवेंशन, जस्टिफाइड आर्म्ड इंटरवेंशन इन डोमिनिकन रिपब्लिक. अभी अपन ने देखा था डोमिनिकन रिपब्लिक को. इधर देखिए, ये रहा डोमिनिकन रिपब्लिक. 1821 from Spain, 1844 from Haiti. Haiti is here. All right. तो इधर इंटरवेंशन कर रहा था कौन? यूएसए, क्योंकि वो चाहता था कि डॉक्ट्रिन के तहत ही यूएसए इंटरनेशनल पुलिस पावर का स्टेटस भी गेन कर ले थ्रू आउट लैटिन अमेरिका. Alright, then shift to interventionism transformed defensive doctrine into active US interventionism, breeding resentment among Latin American nations who felt their sovereignty is violated. पहले उनका सॉवरेनिटी कौन वायलेट कर रहे थे? यूरोपियन नेशंस. और फिर उनकी सॉवरेनिटी कौन वायलेट करने लग गया? अमेरिका, यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स ऑफ अमेरिका. और ये अपन ने किस प्रेसिडेंट के तहत देखा है? रूजवेल्ट. ऑलराइट, सो वी कॉल इट व्हाट? रूजवेल्ट कोरोलरी. ऑलराइट, नाउ थोड़ा सा और है, अच्छे से समझिएगा. देखो, मुनरो डॉक्ट्रिन इन द 20th सेंचुरी. अब कोल्ड वॉर में भी इसका इम्पैक्ट देखना जरूरी है. क्यूबन मिसाइल क्राइसिस कब हुआ था? वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट ईयर. इट हैपेंड इन 1922. क्यूबन मिसाइल क्राइसिस. So the United States, see here you can see the USA flag, and then USA versus Russia confrontation. Alright, so 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis. So the United States invoked the Monroe Doctrine in the Cuban Missile Crisis to justify the opposition to Soviet nuclear missile deployment in Cuba. तो क्यूबा किसका? यूएस बोलते हैं, यूएस क्यूबा सॉवरेन है. ठीक है, और यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स ने क्या एवोक कर दिया? मुनरो डॉक्ट्रिन टू जस्टिफाई ऑपोजिशन टू सोवियत न्यूक्लियर मिसाइल डिप्लॉयमेंट इन द क्यूबा, ब्रिंगिंग द वर्ल्ड टू ब्रिंक ऑफ न्यूक्लियर वॉर. So naval blockade of Cuba was implemented. And direct confrontation with Soviet Union happened. This demonstrated doctrine's enduring symbolic power in this case. All right. So Latin American nation, which was Cuba, was kind of safeguarded, or you can call it Caribbean nation. But what happened was United States invoked Monroe Doctrine in this case, and the confrontation was there, as we know, between USA and USSR. Alright, and Soviet Union is called a Eurasian nation. So this confrontation happened wherein the world was at a brink of nuclear war, as we know. and as we have studied. Alright, so let us see the Cold War influence. Doctrine underpinned US hemispheric security policy throughout the Cold War, justifying interventions to prevent communist influence in Latin America. Alright, exactly. So now, with this case, we can understand that communism versus capitalism, US is propagating its own, you can say, policy stance and his its own view of international economic order, which is capitalism. Of course, this is debatable and we can conclude a lot many things about these theories. But right now, we are seeing that the Cold War that the Monroe Doctrine influenced the Cold War to a lot of extent. Then now, if we try to analyze the post-Cold War era, we see that it continues to shape US stance towards Latin American affairs, adapting new challenges including drug trafficking, migration, and democratic governance. Now let us see certain contemporary relevance and criticism. Modern new Monroe Doctrine, contemporary US policies in Latin America often interpreted as new Monroe Doctrine interventionism, particularly regarding Venezuela's ongoing political crisis and against Trump corollary. So first we saw the Roosevelt corollary, wherein the as you can see the many nations of the Latin America were raising voice, like Dominican Republic was raising voice against the, yes, even Nicaragua and Haiti, against the involvement of Europe and America in various regional disputes. So that was the Roosevelt corollary. Then now we are experiencing the Trump or the Donald Trump corollary. All right, wherein there are significant issues in the minds of the leaders of the Latin American nations regarding the new Monroe Doctrine interventionism, which US tries to justify. See, democracy promotion initiatives are happening. Of course, this is also one of the thing, and then trade agreements and economic pressure is there on the Latin American nations. Immigration policy and border security is there, and Venezuela is a current example of this neo Monroe Doctrine, modern neo Monroe Doctrine and interventionism against Trump, which we call Trump corollary. Alright, now criticism is what? The doctrine faces substantial criticism for fostering US dominance while undermining Latin American sovereignty. ठीक है, सीधी सी बात है, ये लैटिन अमेरिकन सॉवरनिटी को प्रमोट करता था और प्रोपोगेट करता था, तो ये यूएस की डोमिनेंस को ये यूएस की डोमिनेंस को क्यों रिस्ट्रिक्ट नहीं कर रहा है ये डॉक्ट्रिन. ऑलराइट, व्हाई इज यूएस मिस यूजिंग दिस डॉक्ट्रिन? लैटिन अमेरिकन नेशंस इंक्रीजिंगली assert their independence, their independent foreign policies. Basically, they are independent, they assert their independent foreign policies, building relationships with China, Russia, and other global powers beyond US influence, and they also wish to be a independent sovereign power with their own independent sovereign foreign policy influence. But US is doing what? It is interfering. So now we will do this particular slide which talks about UPSC influence, UPSC focus. So, of course, Monroe Doctrine was a diplomatic strategy. We have understood themes like colonialism, sovereignty, interventionism, Cold War geopolitics, and we have holistically covered this doctrine. As we have seen in this doctrine, it highlights US Latin America relations and global power shifts across 2 centuries. Alright, so when was the Monroe Doctrine introduced? You can write it down in the comment section to recall. Alright, here you will see. President James Monroe delivered this to the Congress on 2nd December 1823. Alright, so what is the year you will remember? 1823. And then we had 1923, and recently we had 2023. So it's been more than 2 centuries since this doctrine is in place. Alright. 20 plus Latin American nations are affected by this doctrine's implementation, and one defining principle, the central tenet, symbolizing US assertion of regional dominance and resistance to European colonialism. Alright, thank you so much.